By the time the United Auto Workers began showing its strength in the 1930s, Henry Ford was offering $5 a day for a worker. The mines in the Upper Peninsula were faltering, and the Depression had hit Detroit hard. As auto sales slumped, companies cut back on hours and workers to keep profit levels up. Outside the plants, hunger was rampant, and thousands of people lined up looking for factory jobs.
In the 1920s and into the early 30s, many employers started a much more active anti-union open shop for various reasons, ranging from seeing all of the unions as socialist or after 1919 when the Communist parties formed as communists or as foreigners.
For the UAW, its defining moment came in Flint in 1937, when Walter Reuther, who would one day lead the union, and a few of his aides provoked a strike in which workers took over the General Motors Fisher Body plant. They sat down on the job, threw out the managers, and locked the doors until GM recognized the UAW as their bargaining agent. It worked. Flint and GM was a stunning success, but it was only the first. For the UAW, Dodge and Chrysler would be next, and then the icon of the industry, the Ford Motor Company. In Detroit and elsewhere, the success of the Flint sit-down strike generated widespread euphoria. At the Statler Hotel, the orchestra sat down on strike. Waitresses at the Liggett's drugstore soda counter seized the keys and locked out their manager. Then they called the Hotel and Restaurant Employees Union and asked what they were supposed to do next.
One of the key elements of this internal debate was certainly what the vision or what the role of unions should be relative to minorities and obviously to black citizens. The labor union's tradition in this area has not been that good. Black workers in particular were often seen and used as strike breakers, so there was already some hostility. But within these new industrial unions, or at least in many of these new industrial unions, there was a clear recognition that if they were going to be successful, that they would need to organize all workers, black and white, men and women, and they aggressively pursued that course.
Well, most notably in the history of the UAW, of course, it was the struggle that was involved to organize Ford that required there to be some alliances between whites and African-American churches. They weren't called African-American at the time, because Henry Ford had recruited in the South, and he had recruited black people, not because he was an integrationist at all, but because he saw that as a source of labor and a source of cheap labor at that.
In May 1937, as they stood on the Miller Road overpass at the Ford Rouge plant during a leafleting session to organize Ford workers, Walter Reuther and 3 UAW organizers were attacked by Ford security men. The publicity that resulted was a public relations nightmare, just what Henry Ford did not need. It would take the eventual passage of a new labor law and a Supreme Court case before an election could be held at Ford. In May 1941, 4 years after the overpass beatings, nearly 70% of Ford workers voted to join the UAW. Ford capitulated.
And it was really only the intervention of young black community leaders in Detroit on behalf of the UAW that a very tense division was avoided, and the black workers came out, sided with the UAW, and the rest is, as we say, history.
They confronted a very non-union, open shop Detroit that was in fact famous, and there were some companies that came to Detroit from other places back in the 10s and 20s because Detroit was a non-union, in fact an anti-union town. And so sometimes companies would move from St. Louis to Detroit or Philadelphia to Detroit to get away from unions. And so it's kind of fascinating because now today in 2007, that isn't the vision people have now at all. It's all they're moving away from Michigan to escape unions.
For the UAW, organizing Ford was the crown jewel. Once it was accomplished, the UAW would be the powerhouse of labor. not just in Michigan, but nationwide.
The UAW at its peak had 125,000 members in that one factory complex. Local 600 once had 125,000 members. So if you're going to get that big a place of employment, you're going to get a lot of members if you have that place organized. It comes with the scale of the business.
In the coming years, Reuther appeared on the cover of Time as the most powerful man in America. He was a frequent guest on the dominant network talk shows of the day.
Mr. Friendly, we've said repeatedly that we're not concerned with the number of jobs that the CIO gets or the AFL gets, that we will judge the Eisenhower administration by what it does about the basic problems that confront the American people.
He became a target of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who privately had branded him a communist and a traitor and pushed a U.S. House committee to hold hearings on UAW finances. But try as he might, Hoover and his allies in Congress could not make anything stick to Reuther. Reuther understood that ultimately the union's power rested not just on wages and working conditions.
Because the price structure had largely been decontrolled.
But Reuther very much felt that and argued that there were limits to that, and that unions really had to be more than that. They had to look at some of those old roots of the AFL as well as the Wobblies and the Knights that spoke to improving society and improving their members' lives outside of the workplace as well as in the workplace. And so he became very active in the civil rights movement.
In the 1960s, the UAW supported Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. They provided the financing to bail King and his followers out of jail in the South and provided the buses for the famous March on Washington in 1963. Nevertheless, the political relationship between Reuther and the progressive blacks was stormy behind the scenes. Reuther also had been a strong ally and advisor to Lyndon Johnson as the president implemented facets of his Great Society programs. But when Detroit and other cities erupted in 1967 over poverty, jobs, race, and Vietnam, Reuther found himself criticized for not being active enough. It wasn't until the following year, after Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy were shot and the Vietnam War further split the country, that Reuther finally broke with both Lyndon Johnson and AFL-CIO President George Meany, a staunch supporter of the war. Former UAW President Doug Frazier, now 91 years old, was Reuther's assistant.
Walter really drafted a great deal of the program that involved the community development, the city's programs, and he became very, very close to Johnson because Johnson was interested and was had the power and was willing to exercise that power to try to sort of build a new society. And so they were very, very close, and that relationship continued until the really breaking point was the Vietnam War.
In that period, the UAW led all other unions in securing benefits for workers that were simply unimaginable a decade earlier. The first employer-paid health care system, the first employer-paid retirement plans, the first eye care plan paid by the company, the first dental plan, the first cost of living adjustment, and many more.
Most of the gains, maybe even all of the gains that are part of Americans' work lives, part of what we take for granted, were originated, pushed, implemented, and today are guarded by unions.
On May 10, 1970, Walter Reuther and his wife May and 4 others left Detroit in a small plane for Black Lake, the UAW's retreat and education center in northern Michigan. As they approached Pellston Airport in a storm, the plane came in too low, clipped a stand of pines, and crashed. All aboard were killed. Reuther's death came just as more social upheaval was about to erupt on another front. In In 1973, a conflict now known as the Yom Kippur War between Israel and its Arab neighbors sent a shockwave through the American auto industry and their unions, catching the car companies off guard. The Arab members of OPEC, the consortium of oil-producing states, announced they would no longer sell oil to any country that supported Israel. America was Israel's strongest ally. As gas supplies became scarce, prices soared, and people were forced to wait in lines for hours. America's fleet of gas guzzlers was suddenly sidelined as people rushed to buy smaller foreign cars. The Japanese and Europeans found an instant new market, and for the next 4 years, sales of large cars plummeted.
By the late 70s, the U.S. auto industry is starting to feel this real crisis. And of course, Chrysler almost goes under, and the UAW makes a series of concessions. Doug Frazier at that point is the key UAW leader, and he has these tough decisions about trying to help make sure that Chrysler's going to be successful and that the UAW will still have members there, but give them some breaks to help the company.
Lee Iacocca, Chrysler's chairman, asked Congress to save the company, which it did with a $1.6 billion bailout.
Any suggestion of taking Chrysler through a formal bankruptcy proceeding as a means of reorganizing the company must be dismissed out of hand. We're dying out there with just the talk of it.
But Frazier led the UAW to make wage concessions that were 4 times what Congress loaned, and Chrysler pulled through.
And I get a little weary of the press and everybody saying that Lee Iacocca is the savior of the Chrysler Corporation and its workers. Bullshit. The Chrysler workers saved the Chrysler Corporation.
So the workers made all these monetary sacrifices. And it was the union's influence more than anything else that got that legislation enacted.
In the midst of the Chrysler bailout, a second oil crisis hit. This time, the shortage was created by the overthrow of the Shah of Iran by the radical cleric Ayatollah Khomeini. Once again, gas supplies dried up, prices soared. As tensions increased, auto workers became angry.
And then you had popular demonstrations. Today they look almost ugly, of people beating up on import cars with hammers and stuff, because they were so angry and so scared of what was happening to the Michigan U.S. auto industry.